And let's kick off with introductions. So you're in part one of Scaling Circular Fashion. We'll follow this with a part two. And in this session, we're going to talk about the kind of big picture vision from three very different perspectives. So my name is Cory Skuldt, and I'm an Associate Director at Corporate Citizenship, where I work with companies in fashion and in all industries on sustainability strategy and performance. And my work has focused on circular economy for many years now. And I'm going to ask each of you to briefly introduce yourselves, and then we'll go through a few questions. So we can start with Beth Esponnette.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Thank you so much for the invite. I'm excited to be here with Beth and Debbie and Cory. I'm from the company Unspun, and we are working towards an industry that's really inclusive and sustainable. And I'll get to tell you more about it today. My background is in product design and in apparel design, and especially as it relates to manufacturing. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you. And next we have Beth Ratner.
Thanks, Cory. Yeah, I'm so happy to be here with Beth and Debbie as well. And I'm the executive director for the Biomimicry Institute, and so I'm not technically in fashion, but we advise multiple sectors like fashion, and we represent nature.
Wonderful, thank you. And finally, Debbie Shakespeare.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the invite, and nice to be here. I'm Debbie, and I work for Avery Dennison, who are a big labeling and embellishment organization.
Wonderful. So I'll ask each of you in a moment about the kind of nitty-gritty of what you each do in your work, but I want to start with a very big picture before describing what you do. Could you tell me what drives each of you to work towards a circular fashion industry and what that vision of circularity looks like if we reach our ideal end state and we have shifted to a truly closed loop fashion system? What does that look like? And I'll start with you, Debbie.
Yeah, no problem. So like I mentioned, I work for Avery Dennison, and we're a labeling company. For those of you who don't know what we do, think about it as that label that sits in your clothing that tells you how to wash your clothes, and also the RFID that sits on a garment. And when we think about circularity in the fashion industry, we think about it in two ways. The first one is our own goals and the commitments that we've made to our products. We started our journey on sustainability and circularity probably about 6 years ago, and we've got the goals that you would expect around, greenhouse gas reduction, waste reduction, and circularity. But what really excites us, and where we really see the industry and the space going, it is towards digital, to be able to tell the story of sustainability and circularity. So we see a vision where every physical label will have a digital twin, and then that digital twin could be there to tell the whole provenance sustainability story and end of life story of a particular garment. So that's what really drives us, is being able to how to enable that whole circularity of the industry.
Great, thank you. And Beth Esponnette, you've talked about kind of a future where waste is designed out of the system. What does that future look like for you?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So we really think it's important to think about this from a closed loop and regenerative kind of system, because humans they are so used to, always going for the next thing. It's kind of in our human nature and our survival instinct to want that. And we think it's really hard to change kind of our behavior. And even if we were able to do that, it's not going to fix the problems in the system. And even nature has kind of designed for this. Like, you see plants and animals, and they're shamelessly always on the hunt for the next thing, and that's okay. And it's okay because that's how the whole system has been designed for that circularity. And so we're trying to kind of set up an industry that accommodates consumption and views consumption as an okay thing. And so we're really designing for disassembly. We're thinking about how can we use yarn actually as our kind of, it's like our common denominator almost, to be able to go from yarn to product and back to yarn again. And so that's something we've been developing for the past few years, and is not quite ready yet, but is very, very soon to be onto its first prototypes. And so we really see the industry being no waste and actually infinitely customizable definitely by 2050, hopefully even by 2030.
Wonderful. And Beth Ratner, the Biomimicry Institute has released a report recently detailing a vision for the sort of biological cycling of materials in the fashion industry. Can you describe what that vision looks like?
Sure. Yeah, I love your question because I think ideal is an important word. And the only thing that's ideal is what's worked over time. And we know it's worked over time because we have this biological blueprint, it's right in front of us. And if I can do like a quick biology 101 reminder for everybody. So it's a system, our whole ecosystem, our whole biosphere is open, right? And it depends on dispersal. And the only way that works is by having three elements, three players. You've got your primary producers, your consumers, and you also have your decomposers. It's all powered by the sun. That's what makes the whole system work. Fashion right now is primary production and consumption, and we keep moving around in that part of the loop. And decomposition, we're trying to avoid because of the perception that it's going to be wasteful. But nature wastes all the time. It just wastes in a very different way. It wastes essentially by way of nutrients. We are still shedding, like we still have polyester that's ending up in microfibers, which are ending up in the ocean, in our seafood dinner. We're eating about a credit card worth of plastic every year. So we have decomposition, but just not as nutrients. And so I think the challenge, again, we're not in fashion, we represent nature. I think that's an important point to say, but we can see how systems work. And we know what's successful over time, and it's got to work for everybody. It can't just work for a few. And so we do outline that the future is a biodegradable fiber system where fiber is really valued, and we can get there today. We don't really have to have this abrupt transition. We can move to everything from intercropping and regenerative forms, just like we saw with like Biggest Little Farm. Fiber Shed here in Marin is already doing great projects on that with wool and hemp together. We're going to start seeing new bast fibers grown all over the world. And we're also going to have ag waste. Like you have companies like AgriLoop who are doing amazing stuff. You'll have mycelium. You also have fermentation where you're actually capturing the waste carbon and turning it into new products. So all of that is a biological system that's really possible today. And that's going to be ideal because then when dispersal happens, when entropy happens, because you can't really deny physics, we're going to be okay.
Great. And Beth, you kind of led us into the concrete of what are the practical applications that we can put in place today and that each of us is working towards. Beth E., if I could turn to you to kind of talk to what's the work that Unspun is doing, both in terms of your inventory model and that fiber cycling that you mentioned, that takes steps today towards that vision.
Yeah, all of what we're talking about, these are really, really big problems, and it takes a while to get there. And we've made some big strides towards getting there. Right now, we are completely inclusive and zero inventory. So those are not close to being circular, but they're a really big step, and a huge step for the industry, considering the industry, we're making over 100 billion garments each year. And then within a year, 60% of those are going to landfill, whether they're excess inventory to begin with, or people didn't want them and they just happened to buy them. So there's a really big problem with excess inventory. So for us to create technology to have eliminated that is really big. So what we've done to be inclusive and to get rid of inventory is use technology. So we've basically developed software that takes body scan data and then will automate the pattern making for someone. So you can basically tailor make at scale. And this allows for, again, inclusivity. So there are no sizes, it's just your scan, your body. And also allows for us to be able to automate that getting closer to on-demand kind of production. We are taking next steps towards zero waste and then eventually circularity. And that's where the weaving machine that we've been building, this technology that connects our software to our hardware, that's where that comes into play. And this will really help us because it will not only allow us to make it actually truly on demand instead of waiting a couple of weeks for a product to be made, but it will also eliminate the waste, the material waste that happens when we produce. And so that's going straight from yarn in, and there's no cut waste. So we're excited to, in the next few months, actually be releasing some prototypes from that and be looking for some partners for that.
Wonderful. So the steps that you're taking now will in some ways enable that circularity later by producing only what is truly desired and to be used by the consumer, and then circulating that rather than attempting to circulate a whole lot of excess inventory and material in addition. And Debbie, you've talked about the work Avery Dennison is doing on digital IDs. In practical application now and in the coming years, what role do you see that playing in enabling a circular system?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I guess to answer it, if I rewind us back like 10, 15 years ago and think about how our RFID started to come used. So everybody thought about RFID as a tool that was going to be used to track inventory. And absolutely, yes, it is. And I would say that's a tool that's really come into its own with COVID and brands having to manage inventory with omni-channels and this rapid deployment to curbside picker to know your inventory is there and you can manage it at curbside has really shown how a technology evolves, something happens and then it really sort of comes into its own. Where we see digital IDs is kind of on a similar path. So we see the digital ID being able to replace that physical product. I mean, we've all got labels in our clothes that are the size of War and Peace. Garments are getting thinner and lighter and more sustainable, but then you've got this chunk of fabric that sits in there. And we see that ability to be able to transform that to become a digital trigger, whether it's a physical label or it's something else, it really doesn't matter. And then being able to track that all the way through the life cycle of the garment. And I think the thing that's most interesting in the application where it'll be most useful is really at end of life. So you can help authenticate that product is genuine the second time it's sold. You can understand what the price was for that garment the second time it was sold. You can make sure a consumer knows where the product needs to be shipped to either be resold, repaired, which recycling partner to send it to. And we're seeing in Europe there's the new legislation that's already being deployed around having to recycle garments. And brands and consumers need to be aware of what the end of life instructions are with a garment at the time of purchase. So again, that's how we really see our role playing out in supporting the industry.
Great, thank you. And Beth R., you've mentioned at the beginning the Biomimicry Institute works in many areas, not necessarily focused on the fashion industry. Why is the fashion industry so important to address for the biomimicry approach, and how can the fashion industry kind of move to a more purposeful approach to the way we value our clothes?
Well, thanks. Well, we got asked by the then CNA Foundation, now Loudest Foundation, to do this report. And the big question that I thought was rather brave of them to pose was, if fashion, which we call an ecosystem, really worked like an ecosystem, what would it have to do? What would it have to include? We started to break down that question. We realized that it really kind of came down to that loops leak, and they're supposed to leak. And we didn't design for that. And that's the problem. So, it's like Debbie was having us rewind 10 or 15 years. I'm going to have us rewind about 100 years. And that's what we had. We had this system that was sort of designed for biodegradation. But today we have better weaving technology, we have better processing, we understand dyes and pigments in a different way. And I think where we're headed now is doing a series of pilots. After that report that we wrote, we really see that it comes down to new ways to think about decomposition. And I love what Beth Esponnette was saying, yarn should be valued. We should respect the fiber. And because it took a lot to make it. And so what can we do to have secondary and tertiary markets for that same garment? It doesn't have to always be the same. A shirt doesn't have to always be a shirt, but the fiber has to be valued. And that we see that in nature all the time too. At the same time, we also have to remember that decomposition needs new innovation. We need to be thinking about it very differently. We have masses of fiber that we have to deal with. And I would argue that we don't have to take back our polyester. I think that we should gasify it. That's not the same thing as incineration, but I think we should gasify it, and we should use the waste to energy, or we should use it as to capture with like methanotrophic bacteria to drive a fermentation process. We don't have to think of the masses that exist there as feedstock anymore. We should think of as feedstock for the energy system to drive the fiber.
Great, thank you. So we have a real wide range of visions here. If each of you could ask our audience today to take one action, one step that people can take with them to move towards any of those kind of details of those vision that you've articulated, what would those be? And that could be from in their role in the fashion industry or in their role as a consumer. And I'll start, Beth, back to you, and then we'll rotate around.
R or E?
R.
Yeah, I think it's really compelling to look at the mounds of fashion waste and say like, well, we should do something with that. I think that's a really natural, instinctive vision. In biomimicry, we talk about everything in nature has a function. So what if the big, bold function of fashion as a whole was to clean up our waste and create new jobs and actually improve biodiversity? That is actually all incredibly possible given this move to a biocompatible, biodegradable system, run on regenerative ag, run all these elements we just talked about. What if that was the big, bold vision that went along with where we were? And at the same time, we think of like the polyester that's all sitting in all these massive mounds in our waste management systems as like the Twinkies in our pantry that I decide that I'm now going to be a healthy eater. But first my nutritionist says like, great, but you should eat all those Twinkies first and then go buy your kale, right? Like that's not what's going to happen. We know that the Twinkies are bad for us. We don't have to keep eating them. We can do something else with them. So yeah, my call to action is we don't have to eat the Twinkies.
So we can be more creative and more expansive in how we think about the current waste problem and what the future sort of positive impact of the industry could be, rather than just sort of mitigating negative impacts.
That is much better said than we don't.
And Debbie, what is your call to action for either consumers or others in the industry that Avery Dennison needs to work with to put your vision into action?
I'd say it's a couple. I think firstly, I think the industry needs to move and legislation needs to move. And we're seeing a really big divergence between what's happening in different regions of the world where the legislation's moving. So I think that's got to change, and people need to embrace technology. A QR code does wonderful things. You don't need a physical label for every single product. The stats show that everybody's got the bulk of the world has a mobile phone that can share a lot of this information. And I think as a consumer, my call to action for every consumer is to know where your product comes from. Understand which factories are being used, what products are being used, what the provenance of your garment is. That's something that's within everybody's control. If we all take that responsibility, things will change.
Great, thank you. That's a very practical thing that people can do today, looking at their own closets and deepen their understanding of what it took to produce those garments and what investment they want to make in the future garments. And Beth, Esponnette, let's finish up with you. What is a call to action that you would give to either the industry or consumers, or particular pieces of collaboration that you need to take things to the next level?
Thank you for this opportunity. As a startup, as a really small company, my call to action is to the bigger companies, to the industry as a whole. For our particular company, our North Star mission is to reduce global carbon emissions by 1%, which is a pretty audacious goal especially for a tiny company. And we have our own brand, and we are going to market with our technology already. We're starting to make a little bit of a difference, but we're not going to get to 1% alone. It's really going to be about partnerships and about bigger brands and retailers and also manufacturers joining forces with us and with others in the industry to really make a difference. So for those of you who are listening, who are interested in custom fit, in on-demand production, in circularity, there are a number of things that we're doing, and you can see what we have in the market right now with our brand Unspun, to get kind of a feel for for what we do. But we are very interested in making those connections so that we can all band together and actually make a difference.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for your input on this panel. I want to take our last couple of minutes to look at some of the questions that we have in the sidebar, and we'll do our best to kind of address some of those quickly, and then we'll talk about some of them in the next session. So we have a question on how we make QR code labels accessible to people who are blind or with low vision. Debbie, is that something that's been addressed in the design process at Avery Dennison?
I'd say it's a challenge right now. I mean, and a lot comes down to the reading of those QRs. I mean, there's work in progress to look at it, but definitely something that needs to be reviewed. And also, one of the big reasons that's delaying any of the legislation changes, because not only is it generational that drives change, but also making sure that you really can address every single group that needs to use the technology. I think it's a really fair question, and it's a challenge that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Someone else asked, does someone know of a way to easily figure out where clothes and such came from? I'll take a first stab at this and then see who wants to jump in. I would say that this is one of the ways that you can evaluate the companies you're purchasing your clothing from. Is it easy to find out where these come from and the labor that went into your clothes and the fibers that went into them, or is it more challenging? And I think we often don't see the scale of the impact we have as consumers in asking those questions of companies. I know from working with the sustainability folks within brands that often there's internal champions really pushing for that transparency, and they need to be able to back it up with evidence that consumers care. And so the more that you can communicate your interest and ask those very specific clothing questions, say, where does this come from? Who made it? Who was involved? What were the costs? What were the externalized impacts? The more that transparency can be pushed forward within the company, because that consumer interest is crucial. So don't think that your voice isn't going to make a difference in writing to the company with that question or asking them on social media. Would any of the three of you add something to that in terms of how we can learn where our clothes come from?
I would say just from a brand point of view, a lot of the brands have got their external commitments. Have a look at what each brand has committed to in terms of those organizations that they're part of. They tell great stories. I think the other thing is there are some really good third-party indexes where companies each year, go in and evaluate what the different brands are doing. And I think that's really interesting to see. Transparency indexes.
Absolutely. And I'll make a plug for the Textile Exchange Materials Change Index, which I co-authored on the circularity portion of that this year. We included a circularity module for the first time in the benchmark of materials and sourcing strategies. So you get kind of an aggregated look in that report on how the industry is doing and where the kind of standouts are in companies taking this process to the next level, and where the big gaps are. And I'll look for one more question that we can address here. We had a question early on the labor side of the supply chain and how we're including workers in this vision. I know that we're going to talk about that a bit in the next panel, and how we can make the job creation that comes from circularity equitable, fair, and safe. But in our last moment, anything that the three of you want to add to that piece of the conversation?
I'll keep it brief because I'd love to hear from the others as well. I think that the impacts that we're seeing from dyes and pigments will be one of the first things that get changed, and that's going to affect not just the worker health, but also the entire community that feeds from that same water source. And that's, again, when we talk about technologies that already exist, not just the move to natural dyes is really critical and important, and that's already happening, but there's other things that are coming, like structural color, and even lab-grown materials that will already have that same element of color innately in it. And I think that if we look at water as one of the first areas that we can all focus on, that would be both in terms of, like I said, worker health, but also community safety.
Yeah, That's an important point, that the health impacts on workers and the health impacts on our broader environment are not separate and need to be addressed together. So we're out of time on this session. Really encourage everyone to come back in 5 minutes for the second part of the session. And there's a survey pinned at the top of our comment section. Thank you so much for joining us, and extra thank you to our panelists for sharing your visions today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Cory. Bye.